Linda stood in the hallway of her new apartment building, her suitcase echoing against the walls. She looked around, feeling the cold despite the warm autumn sun outside. The building was quiet, like it was holding its breath. The manager said it was safe. "Cheap rent," he said, smiling. Linda fumbled with her keys. She felt uneasy. Moving to a new city was meant to be a fresh start. But when she opened the door to her apartment, she felt even more uneasy. The apartment was small, with little furniture and low lighting. The only window faced a brick wall and the air smelled musty. Linda dropped her bags and took a deep breath to calm down. "It's just an old building," she said. "You'll get used to it." After unpacking, she explored. The building was a confusing maze of narrow hallways and peeling wallpaper. She passed a few neighbors, but they didn't look at her. At the end of the hall, she saw an old man watching her. His face was pale, and his eyes were dark. He smiled as she approached. "Hi, I'm Linda." "I just moved in," she said, smiling. "Mr. Polanski," he replied, his voice slow. "Been here a long time." "Nice to meet you. It's quiet here." Mr. Polanski's smile faded. "It's always quiet. Too quiet sometimes." He turned and went into his apartment, closing the door softly. Linda felt a shiver run down her spine. She shrugged it off and headed back to her place. That night she felt the silence. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the air grew cold. Then she heard it, a slow, steady creaking from above. Steps. She listened as they moved from one end of the ceiling to the other. It was rhythmic, like someone pacing. Linda tried to ignore it, thinking it was just Mr. Polanski. Maybe he had insomnia. The footsteps kept going. She looked at her phone. It was 2:37 a.m. The noise stopped suddenly. Linda's heart pounded in the silence. She took deep breaths and looked at the ceiling. She fell asleep after a long time. The next morning, she felt groggy and her head was heavy. She checked on Mr. Polanski, worried he might be unwell. She knocked on his door, but he didn't answer. The hallway was silent. She knocked again, louder, but still nothing. She went to the building manager's office. "Have you seen Mr. Polanski today?" she asked. The manager looked up from his desk. "Polanski? I haven't seen him in days. I heard him last night. He was walking around." The manager shrugged. "Old buildings make noise. Don't worry." Linda felt uneasy. She went back to her apartment and tried to focus on work, but the silence felt heavy. That night, she listened and waited. The footsteps began on time. She sat up, watching the footsteps on the ceiling, but this time, they kept going. The footsteps circled and paused above her. The creaking got louder and the ceiling seemed to vibrate. Her breath caught. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. She shone it up, half expecting to see the plaster crack, but there was nothing. Her phone buzzed. She jumped and saw an unknown number on her phone. She thought before answering. "Hello?" There was silence, then a voice. "Linda?" Her blood ran cold. "Mr. Polanski? Is that you?" Static crackled through the line. The voice repeated, "Let me in, Linda. Let me in." The call ended and she dropped the phone. She got up, grabbed a coat and her keys. She needed to leave. But as she reached the door, she heard a knock. She stopped, hand on the door handle. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a whisper. "Let me in." Linda backed away, heart racing. She ran to the bathroom and locked the door. She sat on the floor, holding her phone. The footsteps got louder and faster, moving from the hallway to the ceiling. She called 911, her voice shaking. "Help? Someone's in my apartment." The operator was calm. "We'll send someone right away. Stay where you are." The minutes turned into hours. The knocking kept going on, soft whispers coming through the walls. She covered her ears and rocked back and forth, waiting for sirens. But no one came. The silence returned. Linda opened the bathroom door and looked out. The apartment was dark, except for the streetlight outside her window. She went to the front door and opened it, ready to run. The hallway was empty. The air was cold and the lights flickered. She looked down the hall and saw Mr. Polanski's door was open. She moved slowly, the floor making a noise. She gagged at the stench. She opened the door more and saw nothing. The apartment was empty. No furniture, no belongings, just dust and shadows. She was confused and scared. She backed away and bumped into something. She turned and saw the building manager, eyes hollow, expression blank. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Where's Mr. Polanski?" "I heard him. He called me." The manager looked cold. "Mr. Polanski died 10 years ago. That apartment has been empty since then." Linda was frozen with fear. "I heard him. Every night." The manager tilted his head and his eyes grew darker, his mouth twisting into a smile that wasn't human. "Old buildings make noise," he repeated, his voice distorted. Linda stumbled back, her vision blurring. She ran, her footsteps echoing until they blended with the creaking. She shut her door and took a deep breath. She fell against the wall and heard the knocking again. "Let me in, Linda." She looked around and saw shadows forming shapes and figures that seemed to be moving towards her. The walls felt tight, and she heard whispers. "Let me in!" Linda screamed, covering her ears, but the voice got louder. She crawled to the window, wanting fresh air and to escape. She opened the window, but saw only darkness. Then she felt a cold hand on her shoulder, pulling her back into silence. Mirrors made Eric feel uneasy. As a child, he felt like mirrors hid things. He remembered covering the mirror in his bedroom every night, convinced that if he didn't, he would see something that wasn't right. As an adult, he tried to think it was just a childish fear. But when he moved, he felt uneasy again. The place was modern and clean, just what he wanted. The bathroom had a big mirror on one wall. It was impossible to avoid, looming over the sink and reflecting everything. The first time he noticed something was wrong, it was a small thing. He saw his reflection's eyes move behind his own as he brushed his teeth. He paused, looking at himself to see if there was anything else. The reflection was perfect. He ignored it and went about his day. The incidents got worse. While shaving, he saw his reflection scratch its head. Another time, he saw his reflection smile as he left the bathroom. He stared at the mirror, looking for a flaw, but it seemed normal. It wasn't. The bathroom felt different at night. The mirror seemed to hum with energy. Eric tried to ignore it, but kept looking at the mirror. He stared at the open bathroom door and the dark outline of the mirror. He felt watched. One night, he tested his theory. He stood in front of the mirror and raised his right hand. His reflection did the same. He moved his head, and his reflection did too. But when he blinked, the reflection didn't. Eric's heart beat faster. He blinked again, but his reflection stayed still, staring at him with unblinking eyes. He stumbled back and knocked over the shower curtain. When he looked again, it was normal. The reflection moved perfectly in sync. He laughed, telling himself he was being silly. "I'm tired," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. That night, he lay awake for hours, thinking about his reflection. A few days later, he noticed small objects in the apartment moving. His toothbrush was on the other side of the sink. The hand towel was on the wrong hook. He knew he hadn't moved them, but he convinced himself he was forgetful. But he felt uneasy. Eric was paranoid when he came home late one evening. He saw his reflection in the mirror. He stopped, heart pounding. The room was dark, lit only by the street lamp outside. The reflection's eyes met his. It felt like he was looking at a stranger. He turned on the light. The reflection was gone. He saw his own tired face, but as he turned away, he saw it again. A flicker, a movement that wasn't his. He threw a towel over the mirror and took a deep breath. He needed to leave the apartment. It felt claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in and the air was thick. He called Dan and asked if he could stay over. Dan laughed when Eric explained why he was scared. "You've been working too hard. You're stressed, sleep will help." But Eric felt watched. He kept glancing around on Dan's couch, expecting to see his reflection. He slept, but it was restless. He had dreams of dark corridors and mirrors, showing versions of himself with too many teeth. The towel was gone from the mirror when he got back to his apartment the next morning. Eric stopped in the doorway, breathing heavily. He knew he hadn't moved it. He hadn't been there. He went to the mirror, his hand shaking as he touched the glass. It was cold. He stared at his eyes, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. He laughed at himself for being paranoid. But then, as he was about to turn away, he saw something in his reflection. It leaned forward towards the glass. Eric hadn't moved, but his own face was inches away, staring directly into his eyes. He stumbled back, feeling panic. The reflection grinned, a wide, twisted smile. Eric left the bathroom and closed the door. He called Dan again. "I'm losing it. I'm seeing things, my reflection is wrong." Dan sounded concerned and unsure. "Eric, it's just a mirror. I'll come and check it out." Dan found Eric pacing the living room, pale and shaking. "Where's the mirror?" Dan tried to joke to cheer Eric up. Eric led him to the bathroom and opened the door. He turned on the light and they both looked at the mirror. It looked normal, just a reflection of them standing side by side. Dan looked at Eric, raising an eyebrow. "Looks fine to me." Eric felt embarrassed. "I swear it was different." It was moving on its own. Dan patted him on the shoulder. "You need sleep. Or maybe a holiday." Eric thanked Dan and watched him leave. That night, he tried to sleep, but at 3 a.m., he woke to a cold draft and a feeling of dread. The bathroom door was open, the light on. The towel was gone. He got out of bed, feeling the urge to run. But he had to see. He went to the bathroom on his bare feet. The mirror was there, reflecting the room behind him. He took a deep breath and went closer. His reflection was gone. The space where his image should have been was empty. He was shocked. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, but the mirror was empty. He was panic-stricken and stumbled back, tripping over the rug. The mirror flickered and his reflection reappeared, grinning. It wasn't him. The eyes were dark and hollow. The grin was too wide. He backed away, but his reflection came forward, pressing against the glass as if trying to break through. "Prof. Let me out, Eric," it whispered. "I've been waiting so long." Eric ran and locked the door. He called 911, but the line crackled and he heard only his own laughter. The lights flickered and the air grew cold. The door rattled as if something was trying to get out. He pressed against it, heart racing. Whispers seeped through the cracks, taunting him to open the door. "Let me out." His vision blurred and he felt the walls closing in. The apartment seemed to change shape. He closed his eyes and grabbed the door handle. He was in the bathroom, looking in the mirror. He wasn't outside. He was trapped behind the glass, screaming as the other version of him walked away, leaving him alone. Mark used to have insomnia, but lately it had got worse. Each night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His body was tired, but his mind was active. The voices started as whispers. He tried to focus, but the words slipped away, leaving him with dread. It had been weeks. He tried medication, meditation, and white noise machines. Nothing worked. The voices got louder until they filled his apartment. He knew they weren't real. His doctor said so. "Stress," she said. "You're working too hard. Take a break." But Mark felt it was more than that. The voices were getting familiar. He heard a man's deep voice, a woman's soft voice, and a child laughing. They filled his mind, coming and going. Each time he thought he'd understood a word, it disappeared. One night, the voices got too loud. They got louder and louder, as if a crowd was outside his door. Mark got up and walked around, trying to ignore the noise. He called his doctor again, and she recommended a hypnotherapist. "It's worth a try," she said. "It might help you relax." Mark was unsure but had no other choice. The next day, he made an appointment with Dr. Evelyn Grant, who had an office in an old building downtown. The place felt wrong as soon as he walked in. The air was still and the shadows were long. He was desperate. Dr. Grant was small with blue eyes and a calm voice. She listened to Mark's story, nodding and looking straight ahead. "Let's try relaxation first," she said. "The goal is to calm your mind." Mark lay back on the leather recliner. Dr. Grant guided him through the session, and he felt calm for the first time in weeks. The voices faded, replaced by emptiness. He sank deeper, his body growing heavy. He was in a bright white room with no windows or doors. The light was bright and the air felt cold. He called out, but no one answered. He saw a figure in the distance, its back to him. The shape was familiar. As he walked closer, he realized why. It was him, or rather, a version of him. The figure stood still, dressed the same, but with a rigid, tense posture. Mark's heart raced as he reached out. "Hey, who are you?" The figure turned and looked at him. It had his face, but the eyes were empty. The mouth smiled, but the eyes didn't. "Why are you here?" it asked, its voice distorted. Mark stumbled back, shocked. "What is this?" The figure smiled. "This is your mind, Mark. You've been hiding here for a long time." The room got smaller, the walls closing in. Mark felt a chill as the figure kept smiling, its face changing. He tried to run but kept coming back. The walls got closer and he woke up, gasping for breath. Dr. Grant watched him calmly. "How are you feeling?" Mark wiped his brow. "I don't know. I saw myself, but it wasn't me." "It's normal to see things in hypnosis," she said. "We'll work through it in future sessions." Mark wasn't sure. The figure's eyes haunted him. He slept better, and the voices were less loud. He went back for another session, hoping to find peace. He felt himself drifting into that familiar state again. The white room and the figure returned. This time it was closer. Mark's pulse quickened, but he stayed calm. "Who are you?" he asked. The figure's eyes darkened. "I'm what you buried." The room shifted. The walls became see-through, and Mark saw memories. His childhood bedroom, his mother's angry face, the accident he tried to forget. He felt sick as the scenes played out, overlapping. The figure watched, expressionless. "Stop," Mark shouted. "I don't want to see this." The figure smiled again. "You can't hide forever." The room warped again, and Mark was pulled into the memories. He woke up screaming, and Dr. Grant's voice saved him. She gave him water, her eyes showing sympathy. "These sessions often bring up repressed memories," she said. "We're making progress." Mark wasn't sure. He left her office feeling unsteady. The voices came back that night, louder and clearer. They whispered his name, called out his secrets, and laughed at his fear. He covered his ears, but it didn't help. In the next session, Mark confronted the figure again. He asked for answers. "What do you want?" The figure's eyes glinted with malice. "I want what you took." "What do you mean?" Mark shouted. The figure smiled, but it looked wrong. You know. The room walls bled crimson. Mark backed away, shocked. The figure laughed. "You can't escape, Mark. You never could." He woke up gasping, and Dr. Grant was there. "Are you okay?" Mark shook his head. "I don't know. I feel crazy." "It's just the process," she said. "Things get worse before they get better." But they didn't get better. They got worse. The voices followed him everywhere. He couldn't focus or sleep. He was haunted by taunts and blood-stained walls. One night, Mark woke up in front of his bathroom mirror. His reflection stared back at him, eyes empty. He blinked and the reflection whispered, "You know what you did." Mark fell back and knocked over the soap. He felt the cold tiles and the night air. His reflection grinned, and he saw the same twisted smile in his dreams. Terrified, Mark went back to Dr. Grant the next day, asking for answers. "What's happening to me?" She watched him calmly. "You're facing your fears, Mark. You have to face the truth." "What truth?" he snapped. "The truth you've been hiding. The truth about that night." Her words sent a chill through him. He thought of a car crash, broken glass, screams, and blood. His hands were shaking as he reached for the wheel. He tried to forget. "It wasn't my fault," he said. Dr. Grant's eyes darkened. "Are you sure?" The room warped again, and Mark felt the walls closing in. He stumbled back, holding his head. The voices screamed in his mind. He closed his eyes. He was in the white room alone. The figure stood before him, eyes cold and empty. "You know the truth," it said. "I know the truth too." Mark tried to run but couldn't. He was trapped, hearing the figure laugh. He screamed, but no sound came out. In the real world, he lay motionless in Dr. Grant's office, staring at the ceiling. She watched him, her face a mystery. "The mind can create its own prisons," she said. She stood up and left the office. In the white room, Mark screamed for a way out, but there was nothing. Only his own reflection, staring back at him with eyes that knew everything.